Hey crocheters, this is Shannon with Dogwood Crochet, and today I'm going to show you how to crochet this puffy pot holder. So let's get started. So to make this pot holder, you're going to need a 9mm crochet hook, and then some bulky number 5 cotton blend yarn. I'm using Mary Maxim home yarn, and I wanted to thank Mary Maxim for gifting me this yarn. And then you'll need some scissors, and that's about it. So just a reminder, if you are using this for hot items, make sure that if you're substituting your yarn, you're using a yarn that is heat resistant, so it either is cotton or wool. And otherwise, I'll have the written pattern linked in the description box. So we're going to start by making a slip knot. And then we are going to chain 16. All right, so once we have chained 16, we're going to flip our chain so that we can see this back bump here. We're going to work into the back bump of each chain, starting with the second chain from our hook. So here's the first one, and here is the second one. We're going to just single crochet into each of these back bumps. We just continue this until the end of our foundation chain. So by the end of this row 1, we should have 15 stitches. Okay, so I just finished placing the single crochets into the back bumps of my chains. So now I have 15 stitches. For row 2, we're going to chain 1 and turn. And then we're going to work a single crochet into our first stitch. And then we're going to chain 1. Now we're going to work a puff stitch into this next stitch here. So to do a puff stitch, we're going to yarn over, insert our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, 3 loops on the hook, yarn over, insert our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, 5 loops on the hook, and then one more time, yarn over, insert our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop. So now we should have 7 loops on our hook, and then we're going to yarn over and pull through all 7 loops. And then we chain 1 to close that puff. So that was our first puff stitch. Now we're going to skip over the next stitch, and we're going to do another puff stitch into the second stitch here. And then chain 1 to close that puff. So we just continue this until the end of the row. So we skip 1 stitch, and then we work a puff stitch into the next one. Oops. And chain 1 to close. So I'm just going to continue this process until I get to the end of the row, then I'll come back. All right, so I'm almost to the end of my row. I have 3 stitches left. I'm going to skip this one and work into this stitch here. We're going to do 1 last puff stitch. And chain 1, and then we should have 1 stitch left. We're going to work a single crochet. So at the end of row 2, we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 puff stitches. And then we should have single crochets on either end. Now we're going to chain 1 and turn. And then for row 3, we're going to start with a single crochet in our first stitch and a chain 1. So now we're going to be working into the row below the one that we just worked. So instead of working up here, we're going to skip down and work into this single crochet from row 1 that we skipped over. So we're going to work a puff stitch into this single crochet right here. So just place your hook down into that stitch and pull it up over the row that we just worked. And pull all the way through and chain 1 to close. And then we just continue that across. So we go to the next stitch from the 2 rows below, the one that we skipped, and we place a puff stitch into that stitch. And so we just continue this across until the end of the row. Okay, so I just placed my last puff stitch, and then we have a puff stitch from row 2 here. We're going to skip over that, and then we're going to place a single crochet into the last stitch from the previous row. Just like that. So I find it easiest to count the puffs. So from row 2, remember we had 7 puffs. Now we just finished row 3 and we should have 6 puffs. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 puffs. So each row is going to alternate the number of puffs that you have. So row 2 was 7 puffs. So all the even numbered rows are going to have 7 puffs, and all the odd numbered rows like 3, 5, 7 are going to have 6 puffs. So for row 4, we'll chain 1 and turn. And then we are going to start with a single crochet into the first stitch and chain 1. Now, once again, we're going to be working 2 rows below, and we want to find the space, the chain space in between each puff, and work into that. So here's our puff from row 3. We want to go and find the puff from row 2, and then find the space here. That's where we're going to place our first puff stitch. And then chain 1 to close. So for the next one, you can go look at your next puff from row 3 and then find the one from row 2. And now you can stretch it apart to find this chain space here. I basically just try to find the space that's to the right of the puff that's 2 rows below. And so we just continue this. So here's our next puff from row 2. Can stretch out and find that space and work a puff stitch into that space. Oops. And if you drop your yarn, just start over. And so we'll continue to repeat this across until the end of row 4. So at the end of row 4, remember we should have 7 puffs. So I've worked 6 so far. So I have 1 left to work. And then chain 1 to close. And then we're just going to find this last stitch here from our previous row, and we're going to work a single crochet into that stitch. And then chain one and turn. So now for row 5, we're just going to follow basically the same process. So we're going to place a single crochet into our first stitch and chain 1. And now we're going to look for our first puff stitch from 2 rows below. So that was row 3. So here's row 4 and here's row 3. This is our first puff stitch in row 3, and we want to find that chain space to the right of it, right here. So we're going to work our first puff stitch into that chain space. And then chain 1 to close, and then once again, find our next puff from row 3, find that chain space to the right of it, and work our puff into that space. And then we just continue this across until the end of row 5. So row 5, we should have 6 puffs. All right, so I just worked my 6th puff for row 5, and then we're going to find that last stitch from our previous row and place a single crochet into it. And then chain 1 and turn and begin row 6. So that's pretty much it. We just work repeats of rows 4 and 5 across until we have a square shape. So for row 6, you might want to go back in the video to the row 4 instructions because they're the same. We'll just start with a single crochet, chain 1, and then you want to find the first puff from the previous row, work into that chain space to the right of it, and we will have 7 puffs at the end of row 6, 6 puffs at the end of row 7, and so on. So that's how that'll work, and we're just going to continue working this zigzag puff stitch until we have 17 rows total of puff stitches, which means basically rows 2 through 18 are going to be these puff stitches. So once you have finished row 18, come back and I will show you the next steps. All right, so I just finished row 18. So we have 17 rows of puff stitches. So remember, our first row was just the single crochets down here, and then we have 17 rows of puffs. So if you need to count the rows, you count like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. So each one points in a different way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So we have 17 rows of puff stitches. And now what we're going to do is finish off this last row here by kind of closing up these gaps. So to close up these gaps, we're basically going to follow the same process, but we're going to be placing single crochets into our stitches instead of puff stitches. So we're not doing any more puffs, we're just doing single crochets all the way across. So I just did the first stitch, now we're going to go into the top of this puff stitch. Now we have a chain space. We're going to work our single crochet into the top of the puff from 2 rows below, and that's going to help us close that chain space. Now we're going to work into the top of the next puff. And then once again, we have another chain space, so we'll work into the top of the puff from 2 rows below. Oops. And we just continue this all the way across the row. So you can see how the chain spaces are starting to close up at the top here, which is just how we want it to look. Okay, I just worked into the top of this last puff here, and then we'll just do one more single crochet into our last stitch of the row. And now we have a nice looking square, which is perfect. And you can see our chain spaces, the gaps filled in on the top, which is awesome. So now what we're going to do next is we just have to do this border here, and then we just have to do this little loop, and then we're done. So to start the border, I'm actually going to fasten off and just leave a tail that's long enough to weave in. Now we're actually going to be working with 3 strands of yarn instead of 1. And not to worry if you only have 1 ball of yarn, this technique will work to still let you work with 3 strands even though you have 1 ball of yarn. So to do this technique, we're going to lay our yarn flat in a zigzag like this, like a Z shape. So our yarn tail is over here on the right, and then the working yarn is going into our ball of yarn right here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pinch these 3 strands together, and then we're going to get the side with the yarn tail and just bring it over here, and we're going to make a slip knot like we would to start any other crochet project. And now we're going to pull these strands through to make that slip knot. Just like that. So now you can see this is kind of like our yarn tail basically. And then this is our working yarn. And so what we're going to do is we're going to place this into our first kind of corner here. So I'm actually going to slip my hook out, making sure that I keep that slip knot. And then I'm going to place my hook in this corner and place the slip knot back on my hook and pull it through to the top of our pot holder. So now these 3 strands here are like our working yarn, and we're just going to slip stitch all the way around this entire border using this 3 strand method. So I'm just going to look for this next space here, going to yarn over and pull up a loop and then pull it through this loop that's on my hook. Just like that. And we just continue. So find the next little space to work into, pull up a loop, and pull it through the loop that's on our hook. And so once this loop here starts to get small, what we're going to do is place our hands through the loop and pull this working strand. So this is the strand that's attached to our ball of yarn. We're just going to pull it through the loop like this. So see now how it's folded? There's now 3 more strands here. And now we have an even bigger loop And when we get to the end of this loop, we'll pull it through again and get the 3 strands again. So that's basically how you do this technique. And we just do this and slip stitch all the way around the border of our pot holder. So here's how it's looking so far. And we just keep repeating this all the way around. So I will keep working on this and then I'll come back when we're ready to finish up. All right, I'm approaching my starting point here. I have almost gone all the way around the border. Just have a few more stitches to slip stitch into. All right. So now we are just going to create that little loop. So all we're going to do for that is we're just going to chain 8. Seven and 8. And now we're just going to slip stitch back into this space where we started our chain. And then all we need to do is fasten off and weave in our ends. So I just wove in my ends and here's what our pot holder looks like. It's really super thick and durable and great for cooking and placing hot items on. I have the written pattern linked in the description box. And thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.